2. Introduction. As you have read in the previous module, that the American psychologist B.F. Skinner, 1904-1990, gave the idea that consequences are powerful in influencing behaviors. The concept that behavior can be controlled by rewards and punishments was borrowed by Skinner from Edward Thorndike. Thorndike, in his experiments, had demonstrated that hungry animals would work diligently to solve a problem by trial and error to obtain reward in terms of food. This module will familiarize you with the component of operant conditioning further. In the section that follows, key components of operant conditioning such as reinforcement, punishments, shaping and so forth will be discussed. 3. Components of operant conditioning. In the previous module, the differences between classical conditioning and operant conditioning were highlighted. Following those, we know that the type of conditioning that involves operant behavior is called type R because of the emphasis on response. There are two general principles associated with type R conditioning. A. Any response that is followed by a reinforcing stimulus tends to be repeated. B. A reinforcing stimulus is anything that increases the rate with which an operant response occurs. Or, we can say that a reinforcer is anything that increases the probability of a response as recurring. Skinner, 1953, demonstrated that the occurrence of any behavior depends upon whether it is followed by a reward or a punishment. To understand these better, let us know what is meant by reinforcement and punishment. 3.1 Reinforcement. In behavioral psychology, to reinforce a particular behavior is to strengthen it. Reinforcement is a consequence that strengthens the occurrence of a desired behavior. Reinforcement occurs when either a response adds something positive to the situation or removes something negative from the situation. Each one increases the probability of a response as recurring. Reinforcement is of two types, positive and negative, both of which increases the possibility of a behavior's occurrence. Psychology Paper 1, Cognitive Science. A positive reinforcer is something which, when added to a situation by a certain response, increases the probability of that response as recurring. A negative reinforcer is something which, when removed from a situation by a certain response, increases the probability of that response as recurring. For example, if a Skinner box is arranged so that an aversive tone is discontinued when the lever is pressed, the lever response will soon be learned. In this case, by pressing the lever, the animal avoids experiencing an aversive stimulus. Children and adults also learn to behave in accordance with the rewards or punishments that follow certain behaviors. For children, commonly rewarding consequences include food, praise or hug by a parent, money, grades. All these can encourage the behavior they follow. All these tend to work as primary reinforcers. 3.2 Punishment. By contrast, punishment is an aversive consequence that weakens the behavior it follows. Like reinforcement, punishment also comes in two main forms. One, called positive punishment, which requires the application of an aversive stimulus. For example, when you touch a hot plate, the painful consequence of experiencing the hotness of the plate reduces the likelihood of your repeating that behavior. Another form of punishment is called negative punishment, which results from the removal of a reinforcer. Here, we may take the example of a parent who takes away a privilege such as watching the favorite cartoon from his child. It is important to note that punishment occurs when a response removes something positive from the situation or adds something negative. In simple words, we can say, punishment is either taking away something an organism wants, or giving it something it does not want. Common punishments such as loss of privileges, pain or low grades can discourage the behavior with which they are associated. The table below summarizes the differences between reinforcement and punishment. Table 1. Reinforcement and punishment. Reinforcement. An event that increases the likelihood of the occurrence of a desired behavior. Punishment. An event that weakens the likelihood of the occurrence of a behavior. Positive. Reinforcement negative. Reinforcement positive, punishment negative, punishment. A positive reinforcer is something which, when added to a situation, increases the probability of that response as recurring. A negative reinforcer is something which, when removed from a situation, increases the probability of that response as recurring. Positive punishment requires the application of an aversive stimulus, which reduces the likelihood of repetition of a behavior. Negative punishment results from the removal of a reinforcer, which reduces the likelihood of repetition of a behavior. Psychology Paper 1, Cognitive Science. Please note that negative reinforcement should not be confused with punishment. In fact, punishment and negative reinforcement are used to produce opposite effects on behavior. Baum, 1994. Punishment is used to decrease a behavior or reduces its probability of recurring. However, negative reinforcement, like positive reinforcement, always increases a response's probability of occurring again. It is important to note that the descriptors, positive and negative, mean, add, and remove. Thus, both positive reinforcement and positive punishment involve administering or adding a stimulus. On the other hand, negative reinforcement and negative punishment always involve withholding or removing a stimulus. 3.3 Secondary reinforcement. Any neutral stimulus paired with a primary reinforcer, e.g., food or water, takes on reinforcing properties of its own. This is the principle of secondary reinforcement. The secondary reinforcer consistently precedes primary reinforcement. In other words, a stimulus that accompanies reinforcement thereby acquires reinforcing value of its own, and may be called a conditioned, secondary, or derived reinforcement. For example, if a light comes prior to the animal's receiving food for making a lever press response in the Skinner box, then according to the principles of secondary reinforcement, the pairing of light with food should cause the light to take in reinforcing properties of its own. The same principle operates when a hungry child stops crying at the sight of the mother, even before being fed. The child pairs the secondary reinforcer, the mother, with the primary reinforce, the milk. 3.4 Generalized reinforcement. A generalized reinforcer is a secondary reinforcer that has been paired with more than one primary reinforcer. Money is a generalized reinforcer because it is associated with a number of primary reinforcers. Grades, trophies, medals and awards also classify to be general reinforcers. These all have reinforcing tendency and can be used to increase the occurrence of desired behaviors. Besides reinforcements and punishments, there are other concepts such as shaping, chaining, and extinction that help get a grasp on operant conditioning. 3.5 Shaping. One of the approaches to operant conditioning is shaping. To get clarity on it, let us go back to the Skinner box that you have already read about in the previous module. In the Skinner box, where the animal is kept on a deprivation schedule, the experimenter decides to fire the food even when the animal is in the half of the Skinner box containing the lever. When the animal is reinforced for being near the lever, it will tend to remain in that part of the test chamber. Now that the animal remains in the same vicinity of the lever, the experimenter begins to reinforce it only when it is still close to the lever. Next, it is reinforced only when it touches the lever, then only when it is putting pressure in it, and finally, only when it is pressing it by itself. This process of shaping the organism's behavior is called shaping. Shaping can be used to bring behaviors close enough to the desired behaviors until the desired behaviors are fully attained. In shaping, reinforcement is presented for varying successive. Psychology Paper 1, Cognitive Science. Approximations in forms of behavior as they approximate the eventual behavior to be learned. Step by step, the organism comes to engage in behaviors that slowly approximate closely to the desired behavior. Eventually only the target behavior is the one reinforced. Shaping has two components: differential reinforcement, which means some responses are reinforces and others are not, and successive approximation, which refers to the fact that only those responses are reinforced that become increasingly similar to the one experimenter wants. 3.6 Chaining. Related to shaping is another concept in operant conditioning. This process is called chaining. Chaining is used to condition an individual to produce a specific series, or sequence, of different behaviors before the final behavior is reinforced. One response can bring the organism into contact with stimuli that act as a secondary reinforcer for another response, which in turn causes it to experience stimuli that cause a third response, and so on. This process is called chaining. Most behaviors can be shown to involve some form of chaining. 3.7 Extinction. As with classical conditioning, when we remove the reinforcer from the operant conditioning situation, we produce extinction. During acquisition, the animal gets a pellet of food whenever it presses the lever. Under such a situation, the animal learns to press the lever and persists in doing so until it is satiated with food. But if suddenly, we prevent lever press from producing a pellet of food, we observe that the lever pressing response stops. Thus after extinction, the response rate goes back to where it was before reinforcement was introduced. The response goes back to the operant level. However, the ease with which a behavior is extinguished varies according to several factors, including the strength of the original learning, the variety of settings in which learning had taken place, and the schedule of reinforcement used during conditioning. You are aware that students get reinforced for studying with grade and marks more than once a year. Periodic assessment maintains academic behaviors by encouraging continual studying, rather studying only at the end of semesters. This example will help us understand that in any operant learning situations, the timing and frequency of rewards are crucial. The first question to consider is, how often can we give reinforcement? How much work will be required to earn a reinforcer? Will every response be reinforced, or will reinforcement occur only after a certain number of responses? These questions will be addressed in our section on schedules of reinforcement as under. It will elaborate the possible ways of associating responses and reinforcers to determine behavior patterns of organisms. 4. Schedules of reinforcement. Skinner studied the partial reinforcement effect extensively and eventually wrote a book with Förster called Schedules of Reinforcement 1957. This book summarizes years of research on various types of partial reinforcement. 5 schedules of reinforcement have become the most common and are described below. 4.1 Continuous and partial reinforcement schedules. Psychology Paper 1, Cognitive Science. Continuous and partial reinforcement schedules. In continuous reinforcement schedule, each response is followed by a reinforcer. This is helpful in learning new behaviors such as learning to play a musical instrument, as after each response, feedback in form of reinforcer can be given. But when reinforcement is given after each response, the chances of the organism to satiate with the reinforcer are higher. Using a partial reinforcement schedule, every correct response during acquisition is reinforced. Usually in a partial reinforcement study, the animal is first trained on a 100% reinforcement and then switched to partial reinforcement schedule. It is difficult to train an animal on a partial reinforcement schedule in the initial training period. 4.2 Fixed Interval Reinforcement Schedule (FI). Fixed Interval Reinforcement Schedule (FI). Using a fixed interval reinforcement schedule, the animal is reinforced for a response made only after a set of interval of time. For example, only a response following a 2 minutes interval is reinforced. At the beginning of the fixed time interval, the animal responds slowly, or not at all. As the end of the time interval approaches, the animal gradually increases the speed of responding, apparently anticipating the moment of reinforcement. Here, the behavior of an animal under the schedule resembles a person when she has to meet a deadline. After putting off a certain task as long as possible, as the deadline approaches, the activity increases accordingly. Often students preparing assignments and term papers act in this manner. A paycheck at the end of the month for an employee or a student who prepares for weekly unit test are actually anticipating fixed interval reinforcements. 4 major reinforcement schedules. The 4 major schedules of reinforcement are a fixed interval, B fixed ratio, C variable interval, D variable ratio. 4.3 Fixed Ration Reinforcement Schedule (FR). Fixed Ratio Reinforcement Schedule (FR). An FR schedule of reinforcement occurs when every nth response that the animal makes is reinforced. FR3 means the animal will get reinforced at every third response. Here, the important factor determining when a response is reinforced is the number of responses made. With a fixed ratio schedule, the animal must respond a fixed number of times before it is reinforced. In human situations, when an employee is credited for each item produced, she is being reinforced on a fixed ration schedule. 4.4 Variable Interval Reinforcement Schedule (VI). Variable Interval Reinforcement Schedule (V). With the V schedule, the animal is reinforced for responses made at the end of time intervals of variable durations. That is, rather than having a fixed time interval, as with phi schedules, the animal is reinforced on the average, say, every 2 minutes, but it may be reinforced immediately after a prior reinforcement, or it may be reinforced after 30 seconds or after 6 minutes. 4.5 Variable Ratio Reinforcement Schedule (VR). Variable Ratio Reinforcement Schedule (VR). With the FR schedule, an animal is reinforced after making a specific number of responses, but with VR, say VR3 schedule, the animal is. Psychology Paper 1. Cognitive Science. Reinforced on the average of every 3 responses, thus it might receive 2 reinforcers in a row or make 10 responses without being reinforced. The VR schedules eliminate the step-like cumulative recording found with the FR schedule and produce the highest response rate of the 5 schedules considered above. The VR reinforcement schedule is the one that governs the behaviors of gamblers. The faster one pulls the handle of a slot machine, the more frequently one is reinforced. To summarize, if an organism receives a reinforcer every time it makes an appropriate response during learning, and then placed on extinction, it will extinguish faster than an organism who had only a certain % of its correct responses reinforced during acquisition. In other words, partial reinforcement leads to greater resistance to extinction than continuous reinforcement. Continuous reinforcement yields the least resistance to extinction and the lowest response rate during training. All partial reinforcement schedules produce greater resistance to extinction and higher response rates during training than continuous reinforcement. Ordinarily, the VR schedule produces the highest response rate, FR produces the next highest rate, then V, followed by phi, and finally CRF. After getting acquainted with the components of operant conditioning and schedules of reinforcement, the section below presents how these principles can be applied in real-life situations. 5. Application. The principles of operant conditioning can be applied to a variety of real-life situations. In various circumstances, operant conditioning techniques and procedures can be applied as they have many applications across these problem areas and situations. They can be used in classrooms with a great deal of success. Role of reinforcement, punishment, shaping, cueing and prompting are especially important in this regard. In education, operant procedures have been used to develop programmed instruction, a teaching technique based on elements of shaping and chaining. Skinner, 1968. In early development of teaching machines, which today have been replaced by computers, Skinner used programmed instruction extensively. His principles of operant conditioning also formed the foundation of various therapeutic applications. Skinner, 1972. Behavior modification, or the process of changing responses through stimulus control, contingency contracts, token reinforcement economies and satiation are some of such application. The following paragraphs help us understand these principles applied to classroom settings. Behavior change strategies includes altering and controlling stimulus situations in which behaviors occur, getting desirable behaviors to occur and reinforcing them, extinguishing and or punishing undesired behaviors, reducing the reinforcing effects of events that lead to or support undesired behaviors and so forth. Reinforcers are often applied in classroom situations to strengthen positive behaviors in students. Young children sometimes engage in undesirable or problem behaviors such as hitting, fighting, destroying school property, use of abusive language and disturbing other students. To minimize the occurrence of such behaviors, teachers use reinforcements and punishments. Teachers give praise and attention when students work and play together constructively and punish them when they do something inappropriate. Praise, however, works best if it is contingent upon the behavior to be reinforced, i.e. the behavior that has to be reinforced should be clearly specified and should be believable. Besides praise and attention, teachers also give tangible rewards such as tokens, grades, goods, etc. to reinforce the desired behaviors. Psychology Paper 1. Cognitive Science. According to Skinner, we are what we have been reinforced for being. If one controls reinforcement, one can also control behavior. To modify behavior, one merely has to find something that is reinforcing for the organism whose behavior one wishes to modify, wait until the desired behavior occurs, and then immediately reinforce the organism. When that is done, the rate at which the desired response occurs goes up. When the behavior next occurs, it is again reinforced, and the rate of responding goes up even more. Any behavior that the organism is capable of performing can be done in this manner. The same principle can be applied to the development of human personality. Skinner, 1953, argued against the use of punishment, as punishment is ineffective in the long run. The change in behavior that occurred due to punishment disappears when punishment is removed. It appears that punishment simply suppresses behavior, and when the threat of punishment is removed, the rate with which the behavior returns to its original level. Thus, punishment is often ineffective and has many negative side effects such as anxiety and heightened emotional response, aggression and lower self-esteem. It provides poor feedback and sometimes suppresses behaviors rather than eliminating them. The punishment-aggression link also explains why parents who abuse often come from abusive families and why delinquents who display aggression often come from homes where aggressive behavior toward children takes place. Commonly, Golden, 2000. Thus, the most significant skill that a behavior modifier can cultivate is to help identify sources of reinforcement. Preferred activities as reinforcers. The Premack principle. It is observed that certain reinforcers are more effective than the others. It is thus important for teachers and others to identify which reinforcers will work best in their individual classroom situations. A helpful guide to choose the most effective reinforcer is Premack principle, named after David Premack, 1965. According to Premack principle, a high-frequency behavior or a preferred activity can prove to be an especially effective reinforcer for a low-frequency or less preferred activity. He first demonstrated this in thirsty rats, where in an exercise their tendency of running on a wheel increased when they learned that the running would be followed by an opportunity to drink. Teachers found that young children will sit still if that behavior is reinforced with an opportunity to run around and make noise later. Et al., 1963. Teachers often negotiate by the rule, first you do what I want you to do, then you may do what you want to do. By using this technique, the teacher can manage classroom situations much better. The same principle can be applied by parents to help children manage themselves and utilize their time optimally. Parents and teachers can apply Premack principle to engage children and others in otherwise unlikely behavior. For instance, the opportunity to play with friends, which is usually a preferred activity, can be used as a reinforcer to a less preferred activity of cleaning room or arranging the almirah. For instance, the opportunity to play with friends, which is usually a preferred activity, can be used as a reinforcer to a less preferred activity of cleaning room or arranging the almirah. Other classroom strategies. In a process called the token economy, students are rewarded for good classroom behaviors or even independent study management programs using points or tokens that may be traded for more primary forms of reinforcement. Token economies rely upon conditioned reinforcers, such as points, or stars on a chart, grades, etc. Both positive reinforcement and secondary reinforcers are used in using token economies. Behavior modification is accomplished through the use of tokens to reward certain behaviors that occur during certain situations. Often these tokens can be traded in for more direct and tangible reinforcers in the form of toys, favorite foods, time for a computer game or watching television, etc. Psychology Paper 1. Cognitive Science. You have already read about shaping in the sections above. The key to shaping is the use of successive approximations that are small enough steps so that there is an easy transition from one step to the next. This can be used to teach children to learn desired behaviors. Small sub-goals of tasks can be set and children can be inducted to slowly achieve them. For instance, children may begin to read for 10 minutes and then add 1 extra minute every successive day, and gradually shaping reading for longer periods of time. Adding and eliminating cues and prompts into situations help children focus attention and modify their behaviors. For example, in improving study habits, a significant component is establishing good study areas. If a student sits on a particular sofa or seat when studying, then the sofa will cue his/her thoughts, feelings, and behavior tendencies that may be compatible with studying. It is hence desirable to set up an area, perhaps a desk in a corner with less noise. In this area one may only study and nothing else takes place. Similarly, other areas can be marked for other tasks. To modify problematic behaviors, verbal and visual cues can be added to situations, which can remind and thereby stop the child just before she engages or gets into the tendency to engage in a problematic behavior. Another variation of operant procedures is contingency contracting, Hayes, 1976, et al., 1969, a program in which a well-specified, formalized written contract is imposed on people, especially between young children and the teacher, where both agree on certain points. The teacher sets up a contract, specifying what is expected of the students, academically and non-academically, and what reinforcements they may expect for behaving these ways. For example, a contract may state that if a child completes a particular task well in time, the teacher will give him/her 10 minutes extra to play in the field. Here, the best approach is to involve all people, as much as possible, in the process of negotiating about the nature of the contract. Thus, the teacher often plays the role of a consultant and negotiator in contracting. Another approach is stimulus satiation, in which the child or the client is flooded with the reinforcer repeatedly until it loses much or all of its reinforcing effect. A child who insists on watching television or playing computer games is allowed to do so until the activity loses their reinforcing effect. 6. Summary. The type of conditioning that involves operant behavior is called type R because of the emphasis on response. Any response that is followed by a reinforcing stimulus tends to be repeated. Reinforcement is a consequence that strengthens the occurrence of a desired behavior. Reinforcement is of two types: positive and negative reinforcement, both of which increases the possibility of a behavior's occurrence. Punishment is an aversive consequence that weakens the behavior it follows. Punishment is of two types: positive and negative punishment, both reduces the likelihood of repetition of a behavior. Psychology Paper 1. Cognitive Science. Any neutral stimulus that accompanies reinforcement thereby acquires reinforcing value of its own, and may be called a conditioned, secondary, or derived reinforcement. A generalized reinforcer is a secondary reinforcer that has been paired with more than one primary reinforcer. In shaping, reinforcement is presented for varying successive approximations in forms of behavior as the organism comes to engage in behaviors that slowly approximate closely to the desired behavior. Chaining is used to condition an individual to produce a specific series, or sequence, of different behaviors before the final behavior is reinforced. The four major schedules of reinforcement are a fixed interval B, fixed ratio C, variable interval D, variable ratio. The principles of operant conditioning can be applied to a variety of real-life situations such as classrooms, programmed instruction, therapeutic behavior modifications, and so on. Psychology Paper 1.